Hi everybody. Welcome to Church of Christ Mind. We're here at our place of sermons, I guess we call that, at the Rhode Island shore. Someday maybe that will change, but for now this is the most convenient and familiar way for me to just share these ideas. And so, and I like being here. There's a frequency to it, which is very nice. So, without further ado, on to the topic of the week. And the topic of the week is enemies. I remember back in the day that Richard Nixon, who was president of the United States, used to have an enemies list. And these are the people that he felt were acting against him, or that he needed to act against. I think I remember hearing John Lennon was on the list and tried to get him kicked out of the country, or did get him kicked out of the country. But this idea of sort of having a list of enemies. And then I think we can define enemies in lots of different ways. Like so the question I'm asking is, who do you see as your enemies? And I'd like to invite you not to spiritualize the questions. And by that, I mean, don't give the answer that you think is the right answer in spirituality. Give the answer that you actually feel. Who do you feel animosity towards, or what do you feel animosity towards? It's just a question to sit with prior to our discussion group on Sunday. Who I honestly see as an enemy? Something that I wish were different, someone that I wish was behaving differently, some event or situation, whatever it is you describe as an enemy. As I've considered this question, we, of course, go to Joshua's teaching, Jesus' teaching, to love your enemies. And he says, pray for those who persecute you, bless those who persecute you. Clearly, he's advocating a radical way of doing things relative to the way the world was thinking in those days, and I think, in fact, the way the world often functions these days as well. Enemies. Why would we want to bless our enemies or love our enemies? I think his teachings work on many levels, yeah? But when we talk about, we're talking about forgiveness in a lot of ways. This is a central teaching for Joshua, throughout the New Testament, Course in Miracles, Way of Mastery. He's saying love and forgive your enemies. Love your enemies. So, at one of the deepest levels of this teaching, there are a lot of reasons. I posted an article, a lot of reasons to love your enemies. It forces you to be more compassionate, to see things from their point of view. Well, how might I love my enemy? How would I like to be treated if I was in their shoes? And thinking these types of questions, thinking that, I've got my point of view, they have their point of view, maybe we both can learn something here. To learn to see from a broader perspective, there are a lot of different ways to learn to create a more loving story about why someone is doing something. Even to see that if I was in their shoes, I'd probably be doing the same thing. To find oneness and practice the golden rule. We'd like to be loved too, even if someone saw us as their enemy. So there are lots of practical levels in which this is a wonderful idea. Loving enemies brings transformation as well. Old enemies become new friends. When there's this reaching out and the willingness to see things differently, when there's love. The Course goes so far as to say that the holiest place on earth is where an ancient hatred has become a present love. That's certainly something that's only going to happen with the practice of loving one's enemy, loving those that you have hatred for. But I want to invite another contemplation about this. When discussing forgiveness in Lesson 3 of the Way of Mastery, Joshua discusses something in a very interesting way. He says, when something is upsetting to you, to remember the first axiom. And the first axiom of the Way of Mastery, it's a teaching that shows up in the text of A Course in Miracles as well. I'm not someone who's really into like remembering the exact pages in the course. I used to be a little bit that way. But it shows up at maybe page 420, around there, of the 600 and something page text. So well into the text. And the paraphrase quote is, "Nothing can come to the child of God that the child of God does not request." Your experience is not being done to you, in other words. It's being done as an expression of your freedom. Because that's who you are. You are that powerful. Of course, in the Way of Mastery, which for me is a sequel to the Course, you could say, it goes deeper with Jeshua's teachings, starts with this profound teaching, the first axiom of the Way of Mastery: you and you alone are the creator of all your experience. You're so loved that you're free, and that nothing can be done to you against your will. It's a radical teaching. And then Jeshua says, and everything else that follows is just a strategy, a way of speaking the language of the student, of trying to help you understand the truth of that first teaching. Everything else, all the other teachings, are just so you really learn that this is true. I and my Father are one isn't later teaching. And of course the teachings on forgiveness and desire and all these things. So in lesson 3, the teaching about forgiveness, he says, when you're upset, instead of coming up with 100 reasons why you should hate your enemy, whatever's upsetting you is in a sense an enemy, turn your attention away from what you think is causing your upsetness. So somebody insults you or whatever. You're upset about that, blah, blah, blah. But so he says, see it as a blessing. A blessing. Wow. Why? Because what we're seeking, the directive of the Course and the directive of the Way of Mastery, is the same. Not to seek for love, but to seek and find and heal, by bringing it to the Holy Spirit, all of the obstacles to love that you have living in your mind. There's a bit of a hint as to what the nature of true enemies are. So he says, remember the first axiom: I and I alone am the creator of my experience. Well, if something's upsetting me, somebody just insulted me, said I'm whatever the insult was, and now I'm upset about that. Well, okay, turn attention away from what I think is causing my upset, which is the insult, and turn it towards the recognition that actually what's happening is a blessing, because one of the things that you're letting live in your mind, an unloving thought that you're still letting live in your mind, the obstacle to peace, obstacle to love that we're asked to find and heal, is actually just been identified. So it's a little bit like landmines. We're trying to find the landmines and then get rid of them. The landmines being the unloving thoughts. We all still have this array of unloving thoughts we're let living in our mind. So first we got to find them. So when somebody presses one of your buttons, they've just found one. And that's why see it as a blessing. Because it's an indication for a need for inner healing. Say, wow, that's just such a beautiful practice. And then there's the practice of later turning it around in radical inquiry, the radical inquiry process, learning to embrace, to love and embrace and retranslate the feeling states and the thoughts that are behind the feeling states. And the thoughts are always unloving thoughts. They're always some version of something should be different. I should be different, that should be different, etc., etc. Whereas if in fact only holy perfection is occurring, because God doesn't have a problem. God's powerful enough that God's not having a problem. God doesn't have a problem with the dream of separation. God doesn't have a problem with any of it. The only problem is that we're dreaming. That's not a problem either, but the perception of problems. So if only holy perfection is occurring, if God is love and that's all that's happening, then what we've done is create this little twist through our creative abilities. We create our experience by what we choose to put our attention on. And we put our attention on this idea of conflict and duality. It's called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Knowledge meaning perception of, good and evil meaning duality and conflict. The idea that something other than love exists. So if that's true, then what's the deeper meaning of loving our enemies? Well, our enemies, because we and we alone are creating our experience, our enemies have to be something in us, because there's nothing else affecting us. So if there's something which is causing us consternation and suffering, or whatever you want to call it, that might be our enemy. But when we actually truly own the first axiom, own the idea from the first week that only love has power and we're free. So in our experience of our own lives, only we have power. And if we're going to define something as an enemy, and I think it's great to put it that way because that's what we see, go ahead, define something as an enemy. Define Osama bin Laden or global warming or your mother-in-law or whatever it is as your enemy. What gets in your skin, up your nose more than anything else? What really makes you angry? Go ahead, judge. As Byron Katie would say, for those who know her work, judge your neighbor is the first step. Don't judge judging. Go ahead and judge. Use it as a tool of helping to find those landmines of unloving thought. And then look at the unloving thought. Love the unloving thought. Bless the fact that it's lived in your mind up until now, and then you can make a decision. Do I want to continue to believe that this should be different? That this person should be different? That I should be different? I should be less judging. Well, how do you know that? Maybe you should be just as judging as you've been. I should be this. The earth should be this. They shouldn't be destroying the environment, assuming they are. Well, how do we know that? We don't really know anything, in a sense. But what we do know and can find is that when we think an unloving thought and attach to it, when we believe something should be different, when we believe it, doesn't mean we're right. But when we choose to believe that something should be different, we can see that we suffer. And if something is causing us suffering and nothing else is, because nothing's being done from outside of us, first axiom, if something's causing us suffering, then isn't that our true enemy? And if we're going to love our enemy, it doesn't mean to say, oh, I shouldn't be thinking that, I shouldn't be. It's no, just you've generated this experience of a dream, really, which is what it's been. It's because it's... I tell this story about a woman who goes to an antique shop. She goes to the antique shop. She's looking for a candle to go behind her, candlesticks to go behind the new sofa she just bought. She just wants something that looks nice to the sofa. So she goes and she buys the candlesticks, and at the end, the antique dealer says something to her on the way out. And, oh, I think these came with, I haven't had a chance to really look at these much. They came with some papers off, where the Provenance, who owned them before and such. If I find them, I'll send them to you. She buys the candlesticks, comes home, they look nice behind her sofa. So she's happy, goes on with her day. She gets a call a little while later from the antique dealer. And he's very serious, and he says, I'm extremely sorry. I never would have sold these to you if I knew what they were. These were candlesticks that were from Germany, from one of the concentration camps. And they were in the hands of the Nazis. They were and likely used to burn candles made of human flesh from the concentration camps. This woman is a bit superstitious, has lots of Jewish friends, is horrified by the fact that this dark thing has found its way into her life. She tries to understand why that might be. She tries to do her spiritual practice. How has this come to me? Why is, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Tries to go on with her day and her schedule, but she feels so cursed, kind of almost, by the fact that this thing has found its way into her house. She has to go straight back to the antique dealer and return it. So she cancels her schedule and goes back to the antique dealer, very upset. So she gets to the dealer, and he's coming out, sees her coming and says, "Oh, I have to apologize to you. I read the wrong papers." These candlesticks were actually, they're very valuable. They're actually sacred objects. They were given to slaves escaping plantations in the South during the Underground Railroad, the years of the Underground Railroad. They were designed to light the way, literally, of those escaping families. And then, as a way of supporting the families when they got to where they were going, in the North, they're made of gold. They were given to the families to sell when they got there, so they'd have some money to start their lives with. They're incredibly valuable. They're sacred objects. They really should be in a museum, and you're incredibly lucky to have purchased it. So now the woman goes, well, first she feels happy about that, and then she realized, well, originally these things were just kind of a pleasant decoration. Then they were a dark, evil thing. And now they're this light, bright, precious, sacred object. And then she thought, well, wait a second. What if they change again? How do I know what's true? When we talk about a dream, what we're talking about, because only love is real, are the unloving thoughts, the unloving stories, the unloving explanations that we have for reality. She had reason to believe, because of the antique dealer, that this was something else, but she had an experience, a genuine experience around the candlesticks as being a dark thing. Her experience was real, but they were never a dark thing. It was an experience that was based entirely on something that didn't exist. When we talk about the dream in this world, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the type of... She lived in a world, for, if you want to put it that way, for a short period of time, in which this dark thing had found its way into her home. But in fact, that had never occurred. So, did she have an experience? Yeah, she had an experience. Her experience was just as real as if it was a loving experience. It was an experience. But was it based on anything real? No. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about a dream. Any perception of anything as being a dark and evil experience, or anything other than love, is the same kind of thing. We're having all these mini dreams, just like she was having a dream about that. So while in an ultimate sense, because only love is real, there are no real enemies, we perceive and experience what we would call enemies, the things that make us suffer, the things that bring us pain. And we can see in time that, because the first axiom is true, forgiveness is always justified, because no one's ever doing anything to you. But in fact, they're only doing something for you. The enemy, and that's a bit for another story. It's the universe is always giving you exactly what you need in order to wake up, including whatever you think is an action against you by another. So forgiveness is always justified, but as we stick to the theme of enemies, what then is truly our enemy? Our enemy are the unloving thoughts that lead us into a false dream, the things that we're allowing ourselves to believe, the unloving thoughts that we're allowing to live in our mind, but that means we're believing them. So gradually, with love, step by step, we just look at the thought and welcome it and question it. Oh, so I'm thinking, what's an example? I shouldn't judge. Let's say we have a thought. An unloving thought, I'm defining an unloving thought as anything where we think something should be different, including ourselves. Because that's conflicting with God. Things aren't different. God's reality is what it is. If we think it should be different, we have conflict. So healing comes through loving our enemies, and our enemies are the thoughts which are causing us suffering. Those are our true enemies. The shoulds, the judgments that we're making. And when we find out what they are, don't judge ourselves for believing it. Love the fact that we had this experience. What did you generate? What experience did you, how did you grow in a way that you wouldn't have if you hadn't had that dream? How did you recognize what you truly want if you hadn't had that dream? Perhaps you developed compassion. Perhaps many other things have happened. All aspects of holy perfection. What do we see, honestly, do we see as our enemies? Aging, illness, lack of money, that person who's dating that person we like, maybe the person we used to date that you're mad at them now. But whatever it is, this sense of self-honesty. Oh yeah, I really hate such and such. They're my enemy. Great. Let's look within and see, what does this really have to do with me? Where am I not loving myself? Where am I projecting my hatred? What are my unloving thoughts about me? Those are our true enemies, our unloving thoughts about reality and about ourselves. Loving our enemies means seeing them, accepting them, blessing them, and then we can choose to continue to believe them or not, as we like. I look forward to the discussion group this week, and you can make your little enemies list in the meantime, and we can discuss it. Thanks for listening.